There are very few studios that have been around for as long as Crystal Dynamics, and fewer still that enjoy the twists and turns of this backstory. Crystal Dynamics was founded in the summer of 1992 in California's Silicon Valley, and its founders were already veterans of the video game world. Dave Morse was a co-founder of the Amiga Corporation, while Madeline Kenepa and Judy Lang were marketing execs at Sega. Kenepa had been so instrumental in the launch of the company's flagship mascot that she was known as the Mother of Sonic. The three entered an agreement with Trip Hawkins, founder of EA, to work on the software for a brand new video game console that was set to change the world. And so began the beginning of a 30-year odyssey, a tale of survival through several generations of the video games industry. You know many of this story's characters, some of them are probably going to be new to you, and there's one in particular that many of you miss. So we're going to try and tell as many of their stories as we can. From the early days of FMV to the creation and evolution of Gex, the legacy of Kain and of Raziel, the work that went into respecting the history of Tomb Raider and how the studio evolved Lara when they needed her the most. But how about some of the lesser known fables too, like the first-person shooter that got transformed into a Deus Ex game and back again, the cancelled post-apocalyptic survival project, the dozens of attempts to make franchises that never quite took off, and of course, what happened when the superheroes came to town. But the story of any studio that's lasted for 30 years is a story about people, and the thousands of folks who have walked through the doors of Crystal Dynamics, those who stayed, and the many more who went on to have storied careers of their own. So let's start with one of those people. An ex-Hollywood executive whose long career in games began at Crystal. And no, that's not a green screen background, that's what your office looks like when you're running one of the biggest game publishers in the world.
Our first office was in the Palo Alto airport in retail space. And I mean, when I told my friends in Hollywood where I was working, it was they found it comical to say the least. You know, I was really compelled by having the opportunity to work with Madeline Kenepa and Judy Lang.
Madeline was just awesome. She was constantly filled with enthusiasm, and she always wanted us to succeed and make something great.
The belief on the part of the team was that they had assembled the best collection of talent in the business at the time.
My first day at the office was actually our 1-year anniversary at Crystal, and I remember the t-shirt said, 1 year, 24 employees, and a microwave oven. And I think I ended up being employee number 26 because I had started the next week and they were hiring that fast that the t-shirt couldn't catch up. But that Silicon Valley startup vibe was super cool. It was going on across technology, and to be able to be sort of a entertainment oriented but immersed in that innovation culture was super exciting. We were working on Crash and Burn and Total Eclipse. Crash and Burn, for example, we had the other drivers as little faces. So one of the things I was doing was aligning audio with those things. Total Eclipse, I was doing video on that one as well. One of the challenges was synchronizing audio, not necessarily synchronizing audio with a video track, but the animators weren't able to animate to the audio track. So one of the things that I ended up having to show, at the time, Strauss Zelnick was working with us, and he had just come on board, and we were showing him all of the stuff, and he was very entertainment oriented, and showed him the video I had just been editing and took all of the frames and put them in there, and the lips didn't match at all. And it was very embarrassing. And in the end, we ended up putting a microphone right in front of the lips. So even though they weren't tracking exactly to the voice, that you could actually get the impression that it was working. The antagonist in the story was Lord Zodak, supreme predator of the Draxide Dominion, and he had these tentacles. So when he talked, his tentacles just waved, and that sort of distracted you from the lip sync issue.
We certainly focused on the quality of the cutscenes, and cutscenes were seen as a necessary nuisance to the business then. Remember, cutscenes really were cutscenes then. You know, you had the gameplay and then your cutscenes, and the cutscenes looked nothing like the gameplay. And we wanted our cutscenes to look really good, and they did. We wanted our games to look really good too. They didn't look as good as the cutscenes. I think the fact that I came from, you know, a film and television background probably had some influence on our on our desire to do that. I think I was the one who was responsible for Kirk.
That was an interesting experience because it was Kirk Cameron actually that starred in the Horde. So we were doing live action video and he was Chauncey the page boy, and those shoots were pretty interesting. That was the first I got a little glimpse of more of the Hollywood side of things. It was a little bit of a weird time in games where there was this Hollywood crossover, because now games could do videos, but there was sort of a figuring out of how to put videos central to the game without losing interactivity, losing the fun of it. And I think Horde did it really well because they used the videos to progress between seasons and stuff, but the game mechanics were very solid.
The Horde was developed by Toys for Bob just north of the Golden Gate Bridge in nearby Novato. Strauss had taken a note out of EA's playbook and started a publishing business at Crystal Dynamics that would help diversify their revenue and broaden their portfolio. Crystal also published Toys for Bob's next game, Pandemonium, but the primary focus of the studio was to develop their own hit, specifically a hit on a compact disc.
I was convinced by the recruiter, who was a good friend of mine named Bob Fell, that Crystal Dynamics basically had a lock on next generation technology, which was, believe it or not, 32-bit games. And that the platform for which they were producing 3DO would be the next big thing.
The install base for the 3DO was a little bit lower than I think expectations, especially at the, as I remember at the time, $700 price point.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so even now that would be exorbitant, but back then it was just outrageous.
I think I'd made a decision based on limited research. I felt the video game business was going to be the next huge entertainment business. And much as I enjoyed being in the movie business, I was not unaware of its underlying economics. And I felt like the video game business was like the movie business in the 1920s, when it was not only exciting creatively, but when the economics were really, really good. And I think I was right about that, although I didn't do enough research to realize that the economics at the time weren't great, because it was still a time when we were dealing with cartridges. We had to order them well in advance of when we sold them, which meant that we had to pick the order quantity that we wanted. And if we undershot it, we didn't get the benefit of a hit, because it was a seasonal business in those days. It was really a holiday business. And if we overshot it, obviously we had dead inventory for which we had to pay.
Cartridges were very bad because you had to make memory, and the memory cost a certain amount. So Crystal Dynamics was the idea that we could now do it on a disc. And the 3DO was really the first disc player, and pretty ahead of its time for what it was. Everything was really, really much more shoestring back then.
Well, it was solving that problem, and it was also addressing consumers' needs for more robust, more technically advanced products. However, I did have the presence of mind within a few days of joining Crystal to realize that we had to diversify our platforms. And we became the first third-party licensee of the new Sony platform in short order.
Any favorite Crystal Dynamics games, if you had to pick one?
I loved Gex.
When we first looked at doing a mascot game, that became one of the key questions: is what anthropomorphized animal is it going to be, right? And spin the wheel. No, one of the things they wanted is unique features. So it was partly, do people like this animal? Would this make an interesting cartoon if it was a cartoon? But more than that, what abilities would I have as this character? And I think one of the things that was most exciting to us about Gex was the fact that they can walk on walls allowed us to play with surfaces, being able to walk on the ceiling or even walk on the back face. So you had not only side-scrolling, but almost this planar platforming gameplay. And again, that tapped into some of the things that we could do with the technology that we couldn't as well. So in a lot of cases, it was because it was a cute gecko. But first and foremost, it was about the core mechanics and that ownable identity that would come from that.
So the crazy thing is we rendered Gex in 3D, but then we put him in 2D, right? So everything was still flip books back then. And I remember Steve Kongsley, the Kong would go in, and I want to say he was the only animator on Gex. And he did, so many animations, right? Because he had to time it to the comedian. And so we wanted to make all that work.
Probably think that hurts. Ow!
Gex didn't actually have full motion video, but we used the CD-ROM capacity for the voice. Obviously, Dana Gould starred as Gex, and being able to have such a huge voice bank was something that you couldn't do on cartridges before that.
You move the headstones, but you didn't move the body.
So Gex was an important game for us, and as a publisher, one of our aspirations with Gex was sort of a mascot game, right? That at the time, a lot of the people at Crystal had come from Sega, and so they had experience with Sonic and how powerful that was as sort of creating an IP in video games, and I think that was the aspiration with Gex.
The moment to moment of a player going, oh, you're so sneaky, I see what you did, I want to get to that lever, but I have to face stick to do it, and then I have to bounce off an enemy. From face stick to bounce on enemy to face stick, right? Your brain goes, oh, I can solve that puzzle. And then when you do, because we're humans, it releases endorphins. Then every 10, 15 minutes, you want a change of scenery. And so therefore the different worlds. You want that every minute or so little wrinkle in the puzzle that makes your brain engage. But then you also want variety in that.
Read that book.
What do you remember about the delays?
A lot of it was, I think, what we all understand much better now in modern games, too much content for a small team to produce at high quality. And I think that was in the early days, in the waterfall schedules and all of that. And we were really young.
I hope I can help you with this. I'm not sure how much we'll see what kind of questions you have about Gex, because it's a long time ago. I went to a party in San Francisco, ran into somebody at the party. I went to Europe and I came back, ran back into the person, or rather I couch surfed, and they said like, oh, I went to a party after you hung out with me and I met somebody who also does video games and I took their number down. And that was it. I called a phone number and it was a producer for Gex Enter the Gecko over at Crystal Dynamics. So moving Gex into 3D and creating somewhat a loosely, I mean, you probably could say it's like more than loosely, but Mario 64 kind of homage was kind of the start. So they had Gex running around on like a flat plane, and the tail whip was in. And yeah, so I think the core mechanics, the bouncing on the tail, so everything was around the tail, really. That was like what does a gecko get you? I vaguely remember like all the polygons had to be of a certain height. And the metrics were kind of set by like what the world, because it was based on some sort of like a matrix or a grid that's kind of like the whole world is sliced up in. And the vertices, I believe, had to like fall in an alignment with that matrix. Which was interesting because, once you have those kinds of constraints, you're like, okay, what do I do with this? And it immediately forced us to create the metrics for Gex, like how high he can jump and how far he can glide across, because you kind of had these restrictions on the world. And then you said, well, if I'm going to traverse this world, then the mechanics need to be able to do that. So it's a fascinating thing to have that kind of constraint immediately, just because of like what you are capable of doing at the time. It's funny, actually, even thinking about this is a trip. I forgot all about that. Those are the days where like I created whole levels like almost on my own, like textured, animated, here's a bunch of ideas for Toon TV, like this world where you just go, and I loved like Looney Tunes as a kid, so it just like went wild. I would create little like 5-frame images, like image cycles, and then you would have to enter it into like a TXT file, like the name of your image, and then you'd kind of set them up in whatever order you wanted. And then you'd get it in the game, and it would cycle through, and it would look like you'd create these little animations and stuff. So I'd have like, once I knew that, I was just like everything in Toontown is like signs are moving and animating, and I just kind of there was no like frame rate or memory checks or anything. It's just like if the game crashed, something was wrong. There wasn't a whole lot of like data tracking to figure out like how what's the frame rate, what's the poly count, whatever. And so what would happen is like a programmer would come by and just go like, it's like, Bruce, your level's not running again, because I would just throw everything in there. And I was just trying everything out with no concept of like memory constraints, frame rate constraints, or anything. And so you'll see in Toon TV, rather than me taking things out, which was probably the more rational thing to do, I left everything in and I just pulled back we had a cull distance. So you can see that you could either render really far distances and then you're rendering everything that's within that distance, or you just pull in some render frustum basically and into the Z depth and it would just fade out to nothing. And it's almost like it became Silent Hill 2, pre-Silent Hill 2, because you don't know where anything is because everything's just like faded out. And you're just wandering around going like, maybe there's no weenies or landmarks because they're all gone. Like each designer of their levels, like myself, I would write a bunch of like random things to talk about in the game, and then Dan would take that and I think he would actually write like the quips and whatnot. And then at one point it was just suddenly there's this lizard kind of talking throughout your level and you're like, what just happened? It was just kind of weird.
Pat, I'll take the floating chair for 200 and the rest on account. Judo chop, baby, yeah!
So during Enter the Gecko, Crash 1 came out, and it was incredible, just the amount of detail on the screen, all the foliage and the plants and moving things, just everything, and there was no clipping or anything. It was just like, how are they doing this? And we didn't know, like at the time, like, oh, if you just like lock the camera and you render only what's in the camera, like you get away with hell. Because we're working in 3D and we're dealing with all these limitations, and here I am pulling like the Z frustum back and the clipping plane back just to render stuff and keep it like the game alive. Because we were trying to do a full 3D game, we were trying to do Mario, and so they were pretty genius. We were watching people play through Crash 1, and then little by little, I think like one person got a job opportunity, like a programmer ended up down at Naughty Dog. And then that basically opened up the floodgates. I think like everybody left. There was a mass exodus from Crystal Dynamics. The whole Gex team was basically gone. And I was around still going like, where did my friends go? And they were giving me they gave me the opportunity to be the director of the Gex 3. And I was doing all this paperwork, and I had Bibles and whatnot, which is back in the days where you designed on paper first, and then like, here's the game, like boom. So I went down to go to Disneyland with Evan and my girlfriend, and then I met Jason Rubin. I brought my portfolio in, and I interviewed at Naughty Dog, and I wanted to work with all the Gex team again. So it was between like being a director on Gex 3 and staying up at Crystal Dynamics, or being a texture artist down at Naughty Dog, but get to work with all my friends and be with my girlfriend. So it was like several different things lumped together. That was like, I had no intention of being in LA or living in LA or working, and then suddenly these opportunities came up, and I ended up being the 15th employee at Naughty Dog.
In Gex, the studio had their mascot game, but Crystal always had multiple projects on the go. In-house games like Akuji the Heartless and Pandemonium 2 were developed, while the publishing business managed titles like Slam & Jam and Blazing Dragons. In fact, there was one Crystal-published title being developed in Canada that the studio had to fly in some fixers to help with.
We went up to work with Silicon Knights, and basically, Legacy of Kain was vast. Dennis Dyack and the team at Silicon Knights, they had all the ideas. So all of the spells and everything, we're the ones who helped. And I actually still have original design docs from that time as one of probably the earliest open world games or of that style. He wanted to push the size, but not a lot of content to fill it. And a lot of the content was I walk up to enemies and attack them. And, so we got involved because I'm a big one on everything needs a shtick, right? And like at some point, every enemy is some version of this is the armored guy you have to get behind, and bosses typically just involve multiple shticks. break it down. Is there green blood that poisons you? And so we wanted to get shticks into these enemies and also funnel the world more correctly. That's when Amy Hennig got involved. And she was a lot further down the path than we were at the time. And she gave the world a nice, good substance and structure. Things like, you can change it to a bat and do the bat flights. She was really instrumental, not in the ideas. That all came from Dennis Dyack and Silicon Knights. It was really just adding structure and making sure that the game was engaging, not only with the amount of content, but that the content itself was the little puzzles I talked about. Every enemy, every little situation, sort of like a little puzzle, and just try and take the ideas they had and turn it into a system.
Blood Omen would be the foundation for Crystal Dynamics' next franchise, but not before a lot of messy legal action and a takeover. Around this time, a struggling Crystal decided to end their publishing business to focus on development. They struck a deal with Activision to create a sequel to Blood Omen, but during development, Silicon Knights filed an injunction alleging that the idea had been stolen from them. This hadn't been the case. The game was based on a concept called Shifter with biblical themes, penned by Amy Hennig and Seth Karras. This injunction was settled privately and gave Crystal Dynamics the rights to use the characters of Blood Omen, provided they credit Silicon Knights as the original creators. While all this was going on, Crystal Dynamics was acquired by Eidos Interactive for the sum of £30 million. And so, with new bosses, the 3DO firmly in the rearview mirror, the DNA of Blood Omen was added to the Shifter concept, and taking what they'd learned about 3D action games from developing Gex, Crystal Dynamics made a PlayStation classic.
I know you, Razier. You are worthy.
What madness is this? What pitiful form is this that I have come to inhabit? Death would be a release next to this travesty.
I started in 1998. I came here and the first project I worked on was the original Soul Reaver game on the PlayStation. I think it was around maybe 25, 30 people overall, something like that. There was 5 programmers total, so it was a lot different from today.
Was it a fun project, challenging?
Oh yeah, it was super fun. It was, they'd gone through a few variations and they were having, the legal troubles with Silicon Knights and stuff that was still kind of ongoing, but had been mostly settled. So the game was pretty much in the shape that it ended up being.
So at the time I joined, it had just shifted from this concept called Shifter to this tie-in to the original Blood Omen and become Legacy of Kain and Soul Reaver. So it started with all of the designers, and there were at least 5 of them, including Amy Hennig, who was the lead writer and the creative director. And they would come up with the paper designs for all of these things. So we'd have like top-down views of all the maps, and they'd talk about the puzzles they wanted to have. At the time, they had designed all of the different setups for Spectral, properties that it had. So one was that it stopped time. Another was that it moved mesh around. It moved the actual environment around, so you could solve puzzles by bringing things together. You could do things by stopping time. So these mechanics were all incorporated into the design. That was handed off to the engineering team, and I think if the engineering team had known how difficult it would be, they wouldn't have done it. But luckily, they just kept at it, and we were able to get an A to B morphing done.
Some of the technology for that game had the spectral realm where you could warp into it. And so there was a lot of stuff that I worked on that, they wasn't working or needed fleshing out. Some of the first stuff that I worked on was getting like the spectral realm, how the artist could do it and how it could morph into that and how you collide with walls that could move around and things like that.
I believe that Soul Reaver was the first game that had complete streaming, whereas once you hit the load, from the very first load, it never loaded again. It was constantly loading the room in front of you and dumping the room behind you. So we were doing the same thing with the enemies. When you enter an area, you would have to have the enemies that were in Spectral and Material in memory at the same time and just hot swap between them. And collision had to be there too, so we'd be very careful about those kinds of things. But we kind of made things a little bit easier for ourselves by making one set of enemies that could sort of float and fly inside of Spectral. And those are the vampire wraiths. That made it a little bit easier to place them. We also had enemies that would spawn in or come in well away from the different walls and sections, because we learned rapidly that if the wall shifted and a creature spawned inside of it, then they would get stuck or fall outside the world. And if garbage collection didn't take place, the AI trying to actually account for that falling creature would actually bring the frame rate to a crawl. To change the look of everything, we stored all of the color in the vertices and used vertex coloring, and we were able to switch that to 2 different sets of colors. It was actually relatively cheap to do the morphing color change because it was only A to B shifting. People think it's really complex, but it's actually not. It's actually 2 different shapes, and it just takes the path of least resistance to get there. Like Amy and the designers were in charge of the design, the engineers were in charge of the technology and tools, and the environment artists were in charge of all of the actual implementation. So, and it was a loop. You know, we'd all go through these things. We would show it to the designers, see what they thought. We would show it to the engineers for problem solving, and we come back to the environment artists to actually implement it and maybe make adjustments for problem solving, including for testing. One test, for example, is that you have a crank that you use to turn to open a door, but it's too far away for you to let go of the crank and run to it. So what we'd have to do is let go of it and then shift the spectral and then run through the door. And so that timing was adjusted by the spacing of the distance of the door to the crank, and several other factors by the timing of actually how fast the door closed and stuff like that.
There was more of a crossover. You do a little bit of everything, even including some design type stuff. You know, I actually made the Soul Reaver. Like, that was the Soul Reaver that Raziel had was my art, essentially. Like, there's a fair number of effects in that game that were done by me rather than an artist.
It was a really fun space, and I think it was one of those games, it's a rare thing where you really know you're working on something special. Like, you just know it in your bones. You couldn't wait to show people. And I think that's how you know when a game is special, is you can't wait to show it to somebody. Oh, one thing that was really hard, though, was the crunch. We were in crunch for over a year. We had to work Saturdays and 12-hour days, and eventually we lost our Sundays, too. But that's towards the end. But for the most part, it was a 6-day work week, and after the game was finished, I actually didn't know what to do with myself on a Saturday. You'd think that would completely burn me out, but instead what it did was it gave me a chance to I just felt this opportunity to push and put things in the game that had never been seen before. I'm a big fan of Gothic design, of artists like Brahm, Yasushi Narasawa, even the inkling of like the bondage culture designs, to the vampires, or bringing the fact of male beauty to it, and also the loss and horror of Gothic poetry. All of those things were all things I wanted to reinforce. At every point, I looked for a way to tie in story elements as Easter eggs, including things from the other Blood Omen game. You could write a whole documentary about how much was cut out of the first one. We changed everything. We changed how it was supposed to end. We changed how Kain was supposed to die in the first one, and we changed that. All the vampires were supposed to die in the first one. We changed that. The whole environments were cut in the first one, and in the second one we lost each area had its puzzle mechanics that led to an elemental forge and a temple. And every time we cut an area, we had to remove those temples around, or cut the ability entirely. And if we cut the ability entirely, then we had these empty rooms that have no purpose. And we're like, okay, well, let's get rid of those rooms and move this around. So there was a lot more editing being done in the second one early on, where we were just like, okay, let's move this together. But every time we did that, it would take Amy time to rewrite things and redesign things, because it's just, you can't just cut an area out. You have to, it's surgery. Basically, you have to rejigger everything so that it plays in a balanced way. So even removing things, cutting things, takes time, because it's not a haphazard activity.
That was exciting for Soul Reaver 2 because we worked on the PlayStation 2. Originally, it was going to be a sequel on the PlayStation, but then they decided to do it on the PlayStation 2, which opened up some exciting new territories. When we made the announcement to the team, one of our artists was so excited, he was just running around the office yelling, "More polygons, more polygons!"
The PlayStation 2 was a quantum leap in polygon count, and we had more memory to work with. We basically pushed how far we could see with the PlayStation 2 what it could do. It's more time, but it's also more polygons. It's also more to create. One of the things that was important to me was when I repainted Raziel with, actually went in there and brought in a lot of detail. I went crazy painting on him, just making every little detail, every little piece on him to make him as cool as I possibly could. Because there was a section in a demo where the camera gets right up into his face. So I'm like, well, I'm going to paint every single vein in his, every single muscle, every single sinew.
We used variations of that engine all the way up through, even in Marvel's Avengers, there was some code that had its roots back in the early Soul Reaver days. And even some of that was from Gex 2, which was the source of the Soul Reaver engine.
a lot of really cool areas that we had built too. I think that, each of the forges, like the Dark Forge is really cool. The Seraphan Keep is really cool. All of these like really interesting things. And the fact that we tied into original Blood Omen was huge for me. So when I got the script and saw that, you could hear Malik in the background, them calling for Malik in the background as Vordor's killing the circle, I was super excited because I remember that first opening cinematic from when I was at E3 playing it. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. So this is that one section that, you're talking about. And so being able to take those designs and look at those original designs as well from the original Blood Omen. And what I'd done is I took Blood Omen and I said, okay, if Blood Omen is like a TV show, let's make the movie version. Let's make everything a little more upbeat, a little more powerful. That was one thing that I think Amy understood better than almost any other writer that I've ever worked with, is that Gothic writing is a lot about loss, a lot about pain. And I think there's a certain beauty to Raziel losing his wings, a certain beauty to Raziel losing his beautiful form. And I think a lot of people mistake it for like heavy metal, and they try to make this like crazy battle thing with Vikings or like crazy demons and stuff like that. But you've seen that in other games and it rings hollow. The reason it rings true for Soul Reaver is because there's poetry to it. There's Gothic kind of, it's like Sandman, right? It's like this pain of loss. Kain felt a loss, Raziel felt a loss, and everybody had this sense that they weren't fulfilled, and also the sense that good and evil are simply points of view. That was really important. So when you look at Raziel, him going from a human who did atrocities to a vampire who did atrocities to this, self-righteous spirit, vengeful spirit. Every time he was one of his incarnations, every time he was an incarnation of himself, he absolutely believed what he was and what he was doing, right? With absolute fanatical devotion, he believed he was right. In his own way, learned this incredible journey about zealotry, about believing you're right and what you're believing in. The more truths he learned about himself, the more he realized that he wasn't always right. So by the end, he's very much a different person, and I think that's a wonderful thing to go through. Anybody who can go through that kind of self-reflection is actually huge in terms of growth, and that's part of the genius of Amy's writing, is like being able to encapsulate that experience.
That one was interesting because it was a little bit of a different style. It was a little bit more emphasis on the melee combat, and we did some experimental camera work that was kind of based on Ico. I don't know if you remember that game from back in the day.
As a playable character, having an elder vampire was huge for us. We're like, well, that's super exciting. How do we not make him a nuclear missile that can just destroy everything and have no challenge? So we were trying to find ways to kind of limit his power. And at the same time, we had this beautiful dichotomy between Kain's gameplay and Raziel's gameplay and how they might oppose each other diametrically. So it was more of a yin and yang type of thing, about opposing points of view, about control and free will, about going through all of those beautiful thematics that ran through Soul Reaver, about an elder king who knows his entire kingdom is doomed unless he can find a way to make a coin land on its edge. Just having that sensibility, that the difference in gameplay, the new ideas for their abilities. We changed the camera system as well to try and do something different, where we're throwing the camera up. It was no longer tethered to the characters. We tried a new combat system, which, kind of similar to Devil May Cry, where you actually launch characters and hit them in the air a bunch of times and slam back down on the ground, which felt like more fun. Just those kind of things to try and bring those gameplay elements together. And at the same time, we were trying to make sure that we hung on to what made Soul Reaver good.
While the Legacy of Kain series was being developed, other parts of the studios were working on a mixed bag of different projects. A handful of Disney games presumably helped bring some money in, while other parts of the team experimented with Microsoft's new Xbox console to create some oft-forgotten gems. So it's probably time we talked about Whiplash.
So when I first joined Crystal Dynamics, we were in Menlo Park, so about 30 minutes south of where we currently reside in San Mateo. We were in an old church that they had converted into an office space, which was pretty cool, other than it leaked every time it rained, which is why we eventually had to move. I came back working on Mad Dash, which was an Xbox launch title. One of the things that was fun about that is it was something different than we had done before. After that, we ended up doing Whiplash, and I think one of the things that made sense about it was it came back to not just featuring mascot-like characters, but really getting back to the the platforming and storytelling roots of some of our gameplay. Whiplash is a game about a weasel and a rabbit who are chained together as test subjects in a insane sort of animal testing facility where this big corporation is trying to develop a bunch of products by testing on animals. And so you, Spanx, the weasel, and Redmond the rabbit try and escape and take down the corporation by smacking into as much as you can.
Oh, wait till Peter hears about this.
I believe in that game when you destroy things, it sort of like ticks down the amount of like stock value of the company or something?
Yes, I think every time you destroy something, there is a dollar value associated with it, and then it adds up to how much destruction you've done to the corporation, yeah. It wasn't very big. Crystal was not a big studio back in the day, so I believe, say somewhere around 50 people working on it. When I came in, there was a pretty decent amount of veterans who had been there, who'd worked on Mad Dash before, or had worked on Legacy of Kain and Soul Reaver. And so there were multiple projects going on. Strangely enough, we used to actually have 2 different engines within the studio at the same time. So what was originally the Gex engine and then became the Tomb Raider, or the Soul Reaver engine, and then became the Tomb Raider engine. And then we had what was called the Go engine. And that was the engine that we built Whiplash on. Gex/Soul Reaver engine, which was what it was by the time I got there, did streaming really well. That was sort of the big thing. And so that engine was really good at doing streaming and swapping, loading, unloading assets really well, letting you sort of run around in, more of a, expansive world that didn't load a whole lot. The Go engines was really a flexible engine that was capable of doing any kind of game. Really, really flexible. It's how we built Whiplash and then turned right around and built Snowblind, which were completely different games. But that engine was super flexible and super easy to use.
I signed up for a peacekeeping mission, not what happened here yesterday. If only Echo Squad was here.
Project Snowblind is another game that gets sadly passed over when folks talk about the history of Crystal, but at the very least there's a hidden story behind the design of the game that's worth talking about. Crystal Dynamics' sister company Eidos Montreal was working on a reboot of the Deus Ex franchise, which would eventually see the light of day as Human Revolution. But Eidos had a thirst for more action games, and so they asked Crystal to try their hand at a first-person shooter.
Yeah, so at the time Deus Ex was owned, the IP was owned by Eidos, and so they had wanted to build a game that I think felt like Deus Ex, but wasn't Deus Ex because we were already working on a Deus Ex. I don't think it ended up coming out right then, it ended up coming out later. They wanted to build a first-person shooter with a sci-fi feel.
At some point it was like, hey, make this a Deus Ex forward game, and so all the assets were made, and then at some point they said, okay, we're gonna scrap that and let's take what we have and jumble it around and make a new story, and we only had about 6 months left to do that, so that was hardcore.
Did that start as its own game, then get Deus Ex layered into it, and then get Deus Ex removed?
Yeah.
Wow.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
Yeah, and I want to say it was called Clan Wars. Fact check me on that, I'm not sure, but I think it was going to be a multiplayer sci-fi first-person shooter, and that's what we started out as.
This type of story is emblematic of the video game business in the early 2000s. Many games companies had not survived the transition to 3D, while consolidation and acquisition had created a spider's web of IP and licensing opportunities. So while Deus Ex Clan Wars had the Deus Ex ripped out of it at the last minute, other left-field IP opportunities were just on the horizon. Eidos also owned the rights to Tomb Raider, having acquired Core Design in 1996, but much like Crystal Dynamics were getting tired of making Kain games, Core were finishing up their 6th mainline Tomb Raider in 7 years.
Early on, we'd shown Soul Reaver to Core, and, we had offered them the engine, actually. We said, hey, you guys can actually use this engine if you want. We're rooting 100% for Core. You don't understand how big of a fan we were for Tomb Raider. So when we got an Angel of Darkness on the, I think it was a couple of days before they launched, and the tester couldn't get Lara out of the dumpster area she was in, and we were like, what, you're not going to release this, are you? There's no way. And so, we had demonstrated competence. We just demonstrated an ability to create, a winning game and to bring a lot of verve and passion to it. So them giving it to us actually felt like a natural extension. It felt like, I think Core is just tired of working on this game and they want to let it go. It really felt like they were just done. We really wanted Core to succeed. Don't understand? It wasn't us versus them. We weren't plotting machinations. We were just trying to do the best game that we could do. And we were so sad and disappointed at the way it turned out. And when they brought it to us, we accepted it with every bit of reverence, of saying, let's make this really great. Let's make the best game we can. It was unfortunate though, because Amy really wanted to work on Tomb Raider. She really wanted to work on it. She asked, the president if she could work on it, and he had said no, flatly, and told her that she was going to be designing another Soul Reaver, and she was done with Soul Reaver. She was, at the time, she was just finished with it. So, her going to Naughty Dog and creating Uncharted, this kind of, you can see the parallels there. You can see what her statement to the game industry was about that, and I think that was very important.
Amy Hennig was one of a number of people who would leave Crystal only to go on to become names in the industry themselves. She departed to Naughty Dog, joining plenty of other ex-Crystal alums like Bruce Straley, Evan Wells, Mark Cerny, and Richard LaMarchand. Glenn Schofield, who was vice president of the company during the PlayStation era, would go on to direct Dead Space and several Call of Duty titles. And this is the other story of Crystal Dynamics, a place where developers cut their teeth. Many of these people were Bay Area natives. They'd grown up here, gone to school here, and when they wanted to break into games, Crystal was here. Throughout our time at the studio, we've come across people who have stayed for decades, and others who left years ago only to come back. Folks at the studio affectionately call them boomerangs. We're not even halfway through the history of the studio yet, but we're about to swan dive into the franchise that would come to define Crystal Dynamics, which is a funny thing to say about a franchise that they didn't create and already had millions of fans.
It's a bizarre memory, but I remember we were driving somewhere. I think we were driving up to our family cabin or something, and unpacking, and our dad had a gift for us, and it was a PlayStation. My dad's an engineer and always, he doesn't play games, but he's really into tech. He's excited about seeing what it looked like, even if he wasn't gonna play himself. And he got us Jurassic Park game for the PlayStation 1 and then Tomb Raider. And my brothers run in, of course, they instantly I just remember them loading up Jurassic Park right away, and that started with that DreamWorks logo and then a raptor sound, and then the kid gets pulled down from the moon by a raptor, and that scarred me forever. But
Got some.
I don't know why at the time they weren't interested in, I just saw the woman on the cover and I was like, I want to play this. I haven't seen anything like this. But we'd always played games together, but they weren't interested in this one as much. And so I just kind of took it and ran with it, and I just remember being in awe. I remember just laying awake at night and thinking about how cool this game was and how cool it would be to be someone like Lara, because she was just so tough and intelligent and articulate and witty and confident, and I was 12 or 13 at the time, and to me that was the epitome of what I wanted to be. I wanted to travel the world and learn about different cultures and explore and all of that sort of stuff. But then I also remember I would call my dad in just to watch me swim, because I was like, look at the water. This is the most unbelievable graphics I have ever seen. And so I would just swim around in pools because I thought it was so incredible at the time. And it was a technological marvel. That was enough. That was just kind of enough for me to feel wow, I have not seen this and I haven't felt represented in that way before. There was absolutely a degree of novelty, right? The fact that there weren't many female characters that were in non-stereotypical roles. But if you ask a lot of women in particular, will say it was, her personality. Yes, she was extremely beautiful and had a very, kind of idealized body type and so on. But that didn't even register in my 12 or 13-year-old brain. I was like, yeah, she's pretty, but look at her flip around, look at the control that she has. She's not asking permission to go anywhere. She's so confident, she's so tough. That combined with the attitude and everything, she was just so inspirational, and she kind of made me feel like I could you know, exist in these spaces that maybe I hadn't seen myself in before. And that's why I say that she kind of inspired me to get into gaming, because it's like, this is a space I don't see a lot of people that look like me.
The first time I played it, the sort of hype had sort of passed me by, if I'm honest. It looked kind of slow. It was, you know, sort of trudging around. I'd seen people play it. I'd seen it, you know, obviously on magazines and stuff, but I think at the time I had a roommate that was playing it, and he said, it's fantastic, and, you know, he finished it. At that time I was making racing games and playing racing games, so I was like into like action and, you know, fast action games. So this thing looked kind of slow. So after he finished it, I said, oh, go on then, I'll give it a go. So I stuck it in my PlayStation, and it was just sort of a revelation for me of a different way of experiencing games in sort of a different pace with the setting, the puzzles. It was fantastic, and it was a great moment in gaming for me.
Just hearing that we might have an opportunity to do a Tomb Raider game was pretty exciting. I think it's something that anyone who was a gamer back in the day has some memory of Tomb Raider as an iconic moment in their gaming history, and realizing what games could be, right? That we sort of talked about a lot of the mascot approach to game design earlier on, and I think one of the things that was particularly exciting about Tomb Raider is it really just kind of blew that out of the water and was delivering a fantasy fulfillment that you know, the same kind of thing you'd read books about or go to movies and stuff. So I think as an entertainment property, it was very compelling. As a game developer, it was very intimidating because you realize that it's not your franchise. You have an incredibly talented core who created it, but ultimately a community of fans who own it to some extent, right? It's that it's important for me always that we're delivering something that the fans can be proud of. So it came with it some amount of just sobering responsibility, but putting that aside and just digging into it, it was such a fun property to work with because of some of those reasons, but Lara herself probably being the most compelling of them. Lara as a character, similar to what we talked about in Gex, where his mechanics were an expression of his physical identity, and it fit nicely for a platformer. I think Lara's similar in the sense that her design is an expression of this adventure that, you know, climbing, jumping, solving, shooting, that these are all some of the most fun things to do in games. So she really was sort of an embodiment of what was fun about action adventure. So there's this perfect fit between such a compelling character, but also such a natural gamification of that experience.
Tomb Raider Legend was, I think, a huge turning point for the studio. I think it forced everyone in the studio to step up their game as developers. When I first joined Crystal, I think, you know, the gaming industry as a whole and the studio was more laid back, more sort of free form and open and wild and crazy, the old cowboy days of video game development. But once we sort of took on the mantle of ownership for Tomb Raider, we got, I think, more serious and more focused on making games, and really took what we were doing more seriously because we knew we had a huge fan base that we needed to, we needed to respect, and a legacy that we needed to continue that was very important. One of the biggest concerns every time you make a Tomb Raider game is, how does Lara look? That was always one of the biggest things that takes us the most time to figure out, and we iterate on the most as we develop the game. We went through tons and tons of revisions of the model and the look and what her outfit was and what her weapons were and how she moved. Lara is the key to the Tomb Raider franchise, and so nailing her is the most important part of it. And so a lot of what we did early on was really focusing on getting her to play well and look in a way that, sort of continued the trend of the previous games, but I think also, refreshed it, like made it feel new again and would excite people. So thankfully there was a lot of game to play. I mean, I think Legend was the 7th Tomb Raider game, so there was a bunch of games to go back and play, so we couldn't dive too deep into each one, so we got to play through them all and read through all the guides that existed on all the old games to really get in-depth understanding of what they were going for. But we knew we wanted to sort of take the best parts of it and then move forward with it and then add some new layer to it. And really, I think bring back the exploration was a big part of it. Like with Angel of Darkness, it sort of took the franchise in a different direction that I think, didn't get a lot of appeal or didn't have as much appeal as some of the earlier entries into the franchise. We knew we wanted to get back into raiding tombs, exploring sort of ancient lost locations, and really sort of bringing the explorer back into Lara.
Tomb Raider has always wanted to be a balance of those action mechanics and puzzle solving and other thoughtful mechanics. And I think that's something we've always tried to maintain as part of its identity. It really is a mix of both of those things as an expression of Lara and her strengths as a character. But there was a question of, well, what do you bring to the table, right? And I think for us as a studio, we looked at probably the most foundational thing we wanted to do was change her control paradigm. That we really felt that with some of the character-based action work we had done in the studio up until this point, having that direct control, more of an immediacy, would bring a lot to the franchise. And then it challenges us to ensure that, because part of the puzzling of that game to some extent was its movement mechanic, then if we bring the immediacy of control back into the character, making sure that there's still that thoughtfulness and parsing of the environment and things like that as part of the puzzling process. And that probably inspired one of our second key things we wanted to bring to the franchise, which was some of the more physics-based puzzles we had seen things like Half-Life do some great puzzle work. One of the things that was particularly fun about physics-y puzzles is you could kind of tinker around with them, that you could play with the parts and start to understand what reacts in different ways, and then ultimately solve that puzzle. That became sort of an infusion into the puzzle language of Tomb Raider as well. So I think those were fluid movement and that intuitive physics-based environment puzzles were probably two things we were most excited to bring to it, while still trying to do everything we could to deliver what people loved about Lara and that experience.
We had this big whole conversation because Lara in the engine was actually not measured in any units that were metrics, right? They were gexels, they were called. So she was like, I forget how many now, but it was like, she's about 600 gexels high. And this whole engine, the measurement of anything in the world when you were building something in the engine was based on the size of gex, right? Because it was a 20-year-old engine. And it had never been changed, but it was so fundamentally woven through all the math in the engine and the libraries that changing gexels to feet and inches or meters was a massive undertaking that nobody wanted to take on.
I got to know all the designers really well on Legend, and sort of had, I think, built up a really good rapport with them and respect from them, working with them closely on the project. And so when Legend ended, they were sort of like, hey, we're gonna go do this small little game off in the corner called Anniversary, to celebrate Tomb Raider. Here's a super small team. So transitioned into design when I was over as lead designer on there, and then eventually became creative director on that project. But yeah, a game as big as Legend with all the mechanics, and we added new mechanics to the game and built all new enemies and everything from scratch. So a huge game that we were only able to do because we could leverage everything that we'd already built in Legend, and then just sort of like take all of that knowledge and all of that process and all of the talents of the people that worked on that, and then build something anew.
There's a degree of truly getting to know a franchise or a game when you go to remake it, and we had the additional benefit and pleasure of having Toby at the time. So being able to remake a game with someone who had the opportunity to have been through it the first time, and then going through that journey with them and saying, oh, here's what I was thinking when we made this scene, or when Laura had to make this choice. But then you could also talk about what were the things that you couldn't do that you wanted to do.
So when we started making Anniversary, the idea was, well, we're just gonna sort of remake it with all of the new mechanics that we had sort of introduced in Legend, and then introduce, a couple of new mechanics into the game, but largely, just remake the old game. And then as we started looking at it and we realized, well, one, the game was enormous, so we couldn't build all of it. So we were gonna, okay, we're gonna have to scope it down. And then so it really became picking and choosing what are the best parts of the game to sort of rebuild as the game. So then as we started talking about that and realizing, okay, well, we're already cutting out 50% of the footprint, and we know we need to map all of our mechanics to it, it ended up being that like, oh, these mechanics don't map one-to-one to what existed before. And so it became, how can we maintain the essence and the sort of the pieces of the game that probably stuck around in people's heads, but sort of reinvigorate it and retell that story with all of the mechanics from Legend and the ones that we added for that game. And so it became more than just a sort of re-arting, it really just became a reimagining of that story. We had a really small team, so every time we would get to a new area that we wanted to build, we would all just gather together in a room and talk about it, and usually within a couple hours, we had sort of nailed down, okay, what are the key design elements we want to put in here? What's going to be the theme? Artistically, what are our goals for it? And then we would just sort of go off and build that. And we didn't have enough time during that game to really go back and change it once we'd sort of made those decisions. We had 9 months to build that game, like from start to finish, which was an insanely short amount of time. We're going to refine it, and we obviously, as with all game design and development, it goes through iteration, and we refine it and make it better and better. But almost every single part of the game was built almost identical to what we envisioned within that first 2-hour meeting about each space. And I think the big focus for us on that game being on puzzles was really designing all the puzzles and working with all the designers on the puzzles was, I think, the funnest part. But had a blast working with all the designers on those puzzles, and especially like redoing the mansion and building all of the puzzles into Laura's mansion and figuring out how all that worked together was super fun. And I will personally apologize to anybody who got to the last level of the game, to Natla's Mines, and then got stuck trying to spiral their way up the giant inside of the structure over lava while platforms were falling away and things were attacking you. I may have asked them to tune that a little too difficult. I'm sorry. While we were working on Anniversary, they were working on Defiance, which was the next entry in the Soul Reaver franchise. So that was what most of the rest of the people in the studio were working on. So after we wrapped Anniversary, then that was where a bunch of people ended up going, and then some people went over and worked on some other things that didn't quite see the light of day.
That game that didn't see the light of day was a project called Downfall. But after the release of Crystal's third Tomb Raider game, Underworld, another massive shift came to the studio when Square Enix acquired Eidos, and thus Crystal Dynamics. At this time, much of the studio was working on Downfall, and during our research I came across the original pitch document, and it was a fascinating read. Downfall was set in an open-world post-apocalyptic San Francisco with a full day-night cycle, and would see your character exploring and base building to survive in a world inhabited by subterranean creatures released by a megaquake.
Yeah, there was always more than one thing going on at Crystal, and this was just prior to me running the studio, so it was around the time of Tomb Raider Underworld, an Anniversary. There was multiple teams going, and there was an ambition to do a new IP. You know, that's a challenge to manage internally when you've got split focus, and what became clear is that we really had to double down on one or the other. You know, the studio was being split across two really big projects and ambitions. And ultimately, Tomb Raider was the one that we really had to bet on, and that was why we didn't move forward with Downfall and with that project or a new IP at the time. It just wasn't the right moment in time. To go into production fully was going to mean just again, it was an investment of people and time and resources that we felt like we couldn't achieve both projects at the time. So unfortunately, it was put on pause, that one. After Underworld, it really was kind of a moment where things needed to change on the franchise. It was, I think other games were coming out, I think around that time, around 2008, so probably Assassin's Creed might have been a series that had launched, Uncharted had launched, and I feel like the trilogy that we did first was about preserving and modernizing the legacy. And this was about actually defining the future.
The games are popular, but the less you surprise people and the less you reach out to new audiences, the more it's inherently a diminishing proposition. So the reboot was an opportunity to say, hey, we've done a few drafting off of this model. I think the audience really is ready to reapply that which is great about Tomb Raider to modern gaming. And as developers, that's similar to when we first got a hold of Tomb Raider. It's sort of a daunting proposition, right? Because you're facing down that same fan expectations and not wanting to disappoint.
And that in the early days, that was just me and one other person for a couple of years, just ideating, coming up with a bunch of crazy ideas, many of which made it into the game and many of which did not. So we knew that after Underworld, we wanted to make a major shift. And so we were tasked with sort of basically reinventing Tomb Raider, which I will tell you, long story short, after many, many years of experimenting and trying all sorts of things, we ended up being, I feel, very close to what Tomb Raider was before, but sort of just tweaked enough with a few new elements and then reimagined through a different lens. But still, I think, maintained a lot of what was previously in Tomb Raider, which is why I think it resonated so well with a lot of people, because we were able to stay true to the heart of the franchise and the heart of the character, but then sort of do a whole new take on it that took the franchise in a different direction for the next 3 games. More than any game I've worked on at the studio, the development of the reboot of Tomb Raider had more experimentation along very different tangents and vectors than the other games. So like at one point, we were gonna have a melee fighting game where Lara had 2 axes and you had twin sticks and you would move them around and she would whack people with the axes, and based on your stick motions, it was very fantastical in the early days. So there was a lot of monsters and crazy demons. We had one section that we prototyped where Lara was in a sort of a shrine, and you went in and you sort of messed up the shrine, and then this crazy giant creature would like smash through and rip the whole roof off and grab the whole level and like move around with you inside of it, trying to like shake you out and reach in and grab you. We had, Lara had a horse for a while. So she would, the original island that the game actually ends up taking place on was much larger, and you would travel around the island on your horse. So that was, we had a horse for a while. Then we decided, well, that's a lot of work, so maybe we'll do a motorcycle. So Lara had a motorcycle for a long time. At one point, we were thinking of a game with a companion. So we had a little girl as part of the main story. You were sort of shepherding this little girl along through the island and keeping her safe, and took on this protector role. It sort of went all over the place. We had crazy mythological demons from Japanese mythology. It was very much more open world at one point. So there was a lot more free roaming and exploration of this huge island. So a bunch of really crazy ideas that we'd ended up not putting in the game as we sort of tried to really define what was the next step of Tomb Raider. And I think the big factor was we sort of went off and we tried a bunch of things, and we tried a bunch of different combat models and different mechanics and different settings. And the farther that we got away from the core of the franchise, the less it felt like Tomb Raider and more just like a different game. And so at some point, you know, after we sort of had wrapped a phase of development where we were just doing prototyping for the sake of prototyping and exploration to try and find different ideas and see what stuck, we really sort of took a step back and looked at everything that we had done, and then sort of looked back at Tomb Raider before that, and we're like, is this really the right game that we should be making for Tomb Raider? And then really sort of stepped back and said, okay, this is all too crazy, this part is really good, let's focus on that. And then I think once we honed in on the concept of survival as one of our core sort of lens through which all of the gameplay was focused and all of the experience was focused, that really became, I think, the turning point at which the game started to be able to have a vision that became ultimately the game that it was. I don't think if we had started and someone just said, take Tomb Raider and then tweak it like a little bit and then come up with the, you know, what it ends up being, we would have been able to get there. It was only through trying all these other crazy things that we were really able to, I think, discern the heart of what Tomb Raider was in a way that we hadn't really talked about before, and go, cool, now we know what it's not. And so by removing all the parts that it's not, we could really define what Tomb Raider was.
We realized on Underworld that things were getting a bit stale in terms of how the character was presented and how the gameplay, you know, the sort of auto-aiming and things like that. And just sort of, you know, I remember like one of the first cinematics was a cine with Lara and Roth talking that was, you know, and hitting those emotional beats where it was really something that I didn't feel like we'd hit in the previous couple of Tomb Raider games. That was really exciting. It was really fun to sort of see that come together. And, you know, there's another sequence where she climbs up a radio tower, and you know, the emotion that you felt from that scene was really great, and just felt like cool that, you know, we had the tech and the you know, the consoles that we were working on, and we could kind of do better, different things, and more emotional, more impactful. That was really exciting for me.
It was about 85, I'd say, working at the studio. Like it was just sub 100, and we started growing it back up pretty significantly. So by the time we ended, you know, honestly, as a studio, we had multiple people in different teams and operations, so it's probably 120, 125, but crazy small team. So at that time, it would have been 2009, 2010, so still a few years before shipping it. It was split. I would say there was a good diversity of folks who'd been at Crystal for a long time, and now you look at some of these folks, then they were 10 or 15 year veterans. Some of them are now 22, 23 year veterans. Like they've been here a very long time. We have a very senior team. Some folks were brand new. They came here for the same reason I did. They saw this magic of this new Tomb Raider reboot. Like, I'm gonna be part of that game. The first 8 games were actually Lara at her prime, right? Even from the first Tomb Raider 1, if you look at that all the way through, all of those games were Lara in her prime, where she's got her smarts, and she's got her money, and she's got her guns, and she's fighting T-Rexes, and these amazing adventures everywhere. This was saying, let's go back to the origin tale. If you think in the movies at that era, Daniel Craig's first Bond movie, Casino Royale, we look at Batman Begins, and so things were happening in Hollywood, a little darker, a little grittier, and they were really telling that origin tale of these really iconic characters, and Daryl and studio creative director Noah Hughes were like, let's do that. Let's go back and take that application to Lara and say, how do we tell the origin? How do we tell something that's different but still familiar? But we already knew these other 8 games existed. So if you think of it, we're telling this origin trilogy for everybody knows Lara Croft, iconic, 2 guns, archaeologist, brilliant, beautiful, all these things.
I mean, the trilogy was always, that's a good question. The trilogy was always in mind. It was always going to be a 3-part act. You know, what each one of those acts were, you know, in detail was not fleshed out in full. But the idea that this was our Casino Royale, basically, and it was the beginning, and then you had to have a middle, and you had to have an end. You know, that was known from day one. And that was where decisions like one of the more colourful, conversations was around 2 guns. There was, a lot of discussion, debate around that, because it was iconic at the time. And we obviously opted for it to be a bow as being the primary weapon in that first game, and subsequent games as well. But not having two guns was pretty controversial on the front of a Tomb Raider cover and in the first game. But the point is without knowing it was going to be a trilogy, then you wouldn't make those decisions. You would sort of try and jam-pack everything in potentially into game one. So we knew that we were going to spread out the development of the character over 3 games and roughly what the arc was going to be. And as a result, this was the forging of a hero. It was the beginning. It was the Casino Royale. It was the moment that she became, and knew her destiny to be a Tomb Raider at the end of it. So even though the second and third game still needed to be fleshed out, there was an arc that was considered all the way through.
At the time, the team as a group had never made an 85 plus Metacritic game. So Metacritic's not the end-all be-all answer, right? But looking at it, it's a good shorthand for us as developers to say, we kind of look at that as that min bar of this is something special that people, it's a must-play game at that point. We'd never done that as a studio, and that team had never done that because they'd been forged from pieces from all over different games. So Daryl had this very firm belief of how do we make the team understand that you're getting to a 75, we know how to do that already, we've done many of those. Getting to an 80, harder, because you have to, that curve gets steeper and steeper to climb that hill, to this really exponential curve to get to an 85 plus. And so that was a huge challenge of saying, no, we really need to push ourselves. We had to change our design philosophy. We had to change our vertical slice philosophy of how we actually make games, of how we looked at content, not make everything for 3 years and then the last year polish it. It's like, make a finished chunk of content as early as possible so the team understands what it took to do that. And it felt much different than shipping one giant game at the end. It felt like you're shipping multiple chunks of the game multiple times over that multi-year period. All of us were used to design document, great, pre-concept, great, pre-production, everything's kind of gray box, and we'll finish it later, to finish this 30 minutes, finish this 90 minutes of content, now finish the next 90 minutes, now finish the next 90 minutes. So it felt like you were constantly shipping a chunk of content, which is exhausting because it means you are shipping content and saying, we're going to put that on the shelf. That's done. That can be user tested, but you know what you have right then and there. You know what quality you've hit, you know what content you have, you know how much playability stuff you have, you know what it took to build that. And so now you have to say, how do we recreate that same amount of spikes for multiple hours for how much money and time you have left? So we had to redo our design philosophy, we had to redo our user testing, and it was foreign to all of us because it was, hey, we're going to go try something new and different. And by the way, the hardest thing you ever do is try and ship an 85 plus game when you don't have a roadmap to do it. If you pick a cinematic moment and say you want to make a great cinematic, you get pretty good at making good cinematics. When you pick a gameplay moment and say we want this feature to be done, this mechanic to be done, the enemies to react appropriately, those systems pushing and pulling in each other, you can do them in what they call gyms or prototype rooms, like just a gray box room. I can run around and test my grapple, or I can test my bow and arrow, whatever. But when you actually start having the systems interact, of the lighting and the weather effects and then the time of day and all of that starts pushing and pulling in a small microcosm of the overall game, you very quickly learn like, oh, that's not going to work, or the stealth angle doesn't work, or the enemies can always see me, or what mechanics do I need? So you can really test that out thoroughly in a small area and then say, great, replicate that. And you can actually hand it to the team as a blueprint, say, do more of this because this is awesome and fun. You can user test it very early, and so you can have these chunks of content. You can say, I know this is good. And something we call a spike chart, lots of game teams use them, of, well, this is an epic piece of adventure. Okay, we have these kind of lulls between the next spike and then the next spike. So these peaks are where you say you're raising the experience of the player up to that 85 plus range. These kind of lulls or these troughs, you want to make those higher as possible. So you want to make your peaks peakier and kind of bring those troughs up where you can. And so as you get these peaks nailed down, you can then fill in the gaps with other content. You can say, how do I lead you to the next peak? And so that's something we invented on the fly to make Tomb Raider what it was.
Fascinating. Do you have a name for that philosophy, or is it just?
It's the vertical slice model is what we call it, because it's a matter of people think there's always one vertical slice at the beginning and that's it. We actually instead made multiple vertical slices, and so that's how we applied it.
Once we knew that we wanted to focus on survival, it became a game where we knew everything about the protagonists and the antagonists, and your experience had to be about survival. So it wasn't just you surviving, but everybody on the island needed to be a survivor in a believable world in which there could be supernatural, but there might not be supernatural. And so it's trying to sort of ride that line as much as we can and let people interpret what's going on as much as possible. As we sort of were defining the game and defining the pillars of the game, that sort of brutality of the survival became a sort of a core tenet that we knew we wanted to sort of carry throughout the game and use that as a contrast to the beauty of the island. Like, we wanted to make sure that we're always presenting these amazing vistas and gorgeous sights, but then there was always this sense of imminent threat everywhere, and that when that came to fruition and when you failed, that was in your face, like how deadly this environment was, to sort of emphasize what a precarious situation Lara had found herself in and what the stakes were, right? That it was like, you know, it's very harsh and brutal, and it wasn't like, oh, you just fall down and get to restart and it's soft. Like it was very much, every aspect of that game needed to feel visceral and impactful in everything that you did. All of her upgrading and, you know, even just like, you know, healing yourself and all that. Like, we wanted to carry that more gritty survival aspect into all aspects of the play, including the death scenes. And also harking back to, like you were saying, the original games that sort of, you know, leverage that in a way.
Oh dear. Back to the start if I want to beat my best time.
I feel like if the classic games had been higher fidelity, they would have been M-rated too. Let's just be honest, like, Lara was falling into spike pits that like pierced her torso and stuff. So, you know, I think that the early games, and you ask fans about like, you know, throwing her off all of the surfaces and swan diving off of things and so on, like, I feel like those games were pretty, for the time, were kind of mature as well. But I think that, you know, one of the reasons that the team explored the mature angle in terms of like the content and was for consequences. And so having the, you know, the ramifications of Lara's decisions be impactful, this is life or death, and really shape her, you know, because Lara's original backstory involved like a plane crash and, you know, being the sole survivor and wandering through the Himalayas and it changing her forever and so on. And so this was just a ship crash on an island and being isolated and so on. So the stories are similar.
The jump was a big thing for us. When we made Legend and with the other previous Tomb Raiders, the jump was sort of it was, you know, it's very linear. You jump in the direction that you go when you press the jump button, and she jumps and she connects to the thing or she misses. And in Legend, we developed a system where, you know, it would know if you were going to succeed or fail when you press the jump, which allowed us to do a lot of really cool animation of her reaching out and grabbing and, you know, barely grabbing on and whatnot. And then on Anniversary, we sort of tried to pull in a little bit of the original mechanics from Tomb Raider 1 and allowed you to manually, you could choose to have manual grab or not. So even though the engine knew if you were going to connect or not, whether or not you pressed the grab button and held on or not during that, you could also determine you would still be able to fail or not fail. And we were like, what do we want to do? And I was like, I want to allow the player, I want to remove the predetermination on the jump. And we had to like figure out how to allow all of the really awesome animation, preemptive, like sort of telegraphing of whether you were going to connect or not, but give you the ability to move freely when you jump. We wanted to put the onus of survival back on the player and really make them be in charge of whether they succeeded or not, and not whether the game decided if they should succeed or not. That was, I think, a really big turning point for us, and really showed how we took the concept of survival and just had it feed through every part of the game, even down to the core movement of the player.
So, you know, at what stage was Tomb Raider as the reboot when you joined?
If I recall correctly, it was in alpha or late alpha. The deal when I was hired was the studio head at the time asked me to cut my teeth on the game and help them with their hunting loop, which I did laugh at a little bit. Okay, are you laughing too, right?
The Red Dead Redemption
The Red Dead Redemption chick, like let's put her on hunting. Yeah, so not lost on me. Yeah, so I joined the Tomb Raider team to help them with the ambient world events, basically, which was mostly the hunting loop. So I got airdropped into a lot of content, very, very fast. Was expected to kind of like, you know, jump in, play everything, understand everything, and then understand how to add ambient activity and life to those spaces. It was a balancing act, and there was also some translation that had to be done like with the production team as well, right? Like I was used to, having worked at Rockstar, like some acceptance that the player would not see every moment of crafted game, right? in a single playthrough, right? Like, if you think about how Rockstar games roll, they're pretty cool with like, oh, this designer went in and like 25% of the time this crazy thing happens, right? So, the way we reviewed our games back at Rockstar, it was multiple playthroughs over long periods of time. With a single setting would be like, all right, let's play it again. All right, let's play it again. All right, let's play it again. Whereas when I arrived here, like every moment was very, very carefully crafted, and that's how everyone was used to reviewing the game. And so I was basically setting up like population spawning. It's like, well, about 25% of the time I get like 1 or 2 deer in this area, right? Reviewing that content was very painful for me because I'd have production come back and say like, well, we looked and we didn't see any deer. Well, how many times did you look? Once. Could you go back and look again? Well, how many times do I have to look? It's hard for me to say. Just tell me like over multiple playthroughs, did you get the feel that you wanted? Did you feel like deer and wildlife were present? Because I feel like if you did feel that, then we did the job, right? But that was a huge transition, I think, for some of the people that were working on that content.
Which way did it ultimately go? Did you bend more towards them, or did they come to?
A little of both,
Okay.
right? It's interesting, like it's a kind of an invisible task, right? But if it's not there, you definitely notice. And since in Tomb Raider, the resources that animals give is tied into the economy and all of that good stuff, like it's a tricky thing to get that balance right. Like you don't want to have too many things spawning and throw the economy completely out of whack, but you don't want to have too few does the same thing, right? Frame rate's also an issue. On the original Tomb Raider, on the reboot Tomb Raider, we couldn't have enemy combats and animals in the same space because of technical limitations. So there was a balancing act being done of like, well, if we want to have enemies show up soon, right, as in we're loading them and placing them, right, then the ambient wildlife needs to turn off and run away so we can dump it real quick, right? And so like a lot of that job was just memory management and trying to figure out how to make the world feel alive, right, and not totally blatantly empty right before a combat starts up,
I think it was a really big moment for us, was that first kill. I mean, this was, timeline-wise, her first kill. So it was important for us to make it meaningful, make it feel necessary, I think was a big part of it. That it wasn't I'm just going to run up and murder this person, but I'm doing this to survive, right? And I have no choice. It's either kill or be killed. Putting the player in that position as part of the experience where they are in the same situation that Lara is in, where they really have no choice, then they can empathize with her and connect with her and understand why she did it and why it was necessary for her to survive on this island. And then use that as the sort of the building block upon which all of the rest of the atrocities that she has to commit to survive on this island can be justified in some capacity. We are aware very much that video games you play a protagonist that often goes around and kills many, many people. And however we can, trying to justify those actions in a way that makes sense and try not to paint our protagonists as, insane serial killers.
We were sustaining the franchise from a number of different levels, right? From the reboot being kind of our big beats at that point with, the Batman Begins equivalent. With Lara Croft, Guardian of Light and that series, we did another one, Temple of Osiris, after, being more along the lines of an animated series almost, where this kind of would live alongside in between, and it allowed the studio, again, there was another reason for this, it allowed us to experiment more in multiplayer, for example, on co-op, and we had a new team on that I really wanted to help grow leadership in the studio. We did a HD remake as well of the first 3, and these were just sort of different efforts we started putting in place over the course of 3 or 4 years. And that allowed for creativity, that allowed for a big beat refresh, it allowed for us to actually develop technology like multiplayer skills and co-op skills and experiment, develop the studio with new leadership, and also give us the breathing room and time to explore what the future was going to be for the mainline release.
When you get to the end of a game and it all comes together is really when you kind of see the game for the first time and really can see all the things that you wish you had done differently and wish you had done better. And so working on a sequel is great because you get that opportunity to sort of, you know, build the game that you either wanted to make or should have made the first time, and, you know, try and address all of the things that you didn't do the way you wanted to. And also, you know, anytime you're in development, you have to cut features. Like, you just never can build everything that you want to build when you're making a game. There's always things that, you know, take longer than you thought, and you have to make concessions along the way. And so Rise was really, I think, the fruition of a lot of the ideas that we started with on the Tomb Raider reboot that we had wanted to do on that game that we just couldn't. And also, you know, taking everything that we had built and going, okay, cool, how can we do a better version of that? Or like, here's where we maybe misstepped a little, how can we address that in the new game?
The first thing that I did on Rise, much like anyone else's first thing in the industry, got cut, which I think was a really good experience to never get attached to anything. But I was brought in to work on a lot of the action moments. So Lara being chased by a bear, Lara being chased by an avalanche, Lara being chased by anything that's trying to kill her. I think it's finding the balance of not being completely systemic, but also not making too quick time event, which is a word that I think if you say to any player, they will crucify you, right? But in the reality is the magic that most players don't see it is quick time events never went away, we just hide them better. Finding the amounts of interactions that you want to put on something that is super scripted, like the bear trying to get Lara from the den, right? Like, we put the prompt on and you have to push the button and hit the axe on it to destroy it. Feels quick-timey, it feels, but like in the game, if you push Y, you do a melee swing. So there's a correlation to it. Simplest version of an interaction that we can put on a non-systemic scenario that players will enjoy it and not feel like we're robbing them from the agency of it. Of like, oh, I am just pushing a button and watching a movie play. Crystal is a very narrative-driven studio, so story takes a big priority. So usually it starts with, you know, at whatever point of the story, Lara or Kamala or whoever it is it's at, and then there's the overall goal or the idea, you know, like it starts as simple as like, we're gonna put Lara in the tsunami, and then that's it. And then we're like, all right, cool, I guess I'll go figure out how to make a tsunami in video games, and then just play testing with that. And then from that, we usually take okay, I've been, you know, sticking left and right to dodge things. It feels good for about like 30 seconds. After that, after a minute, it starts to get old. We need to introduce something else. And then like after a minute and a half, like, we need to vary the gameplay a little bit. Like, maybe we'll put it back up and we'll do some climbing. So at that point, it becomes more on the devs. And then like, as long as we're following the direction or the high level for it, it's a conversation between the two.
I was on what we called the Kaplooey team because we love our acronyms at Crystal. It was comprised of character animation, player animation, weapons, enemies, and interactions. Put yourself in a room. When you walk from wall to wall, do you hear your footsteps? Do you hear the rustling of your jeans? Do you hear the rustling of your shirt when your arms like walk across your body? Is there a window open? Do you hear birds outside? Do you hear wind coming through the window? Wind coming through the blinds? You just kind of think of a soundscape, essentially. And so it is taking all the environment as a whole and making sure that it's an immersive experience rather than something detracting, unless it's purposeful. Right. As a systemic audio designer, you take cues from level design where they have put specific moments that the player would need their attention diverted from the overall experience. And so with that team, we had to make sure that systemically, wolves, I was in charge of wolves, I was in charge of any of the animals that were in the game that would attack the player. I was in charge of the bear fight, which Stoya, who we named her, that bear fight was probably one of my most fun experiences with the audio team, because that was one of the biggest challenges, is getting that fight right, where it didn't sound boring, but when the bear wasn't on screen before the attack would come, you could give a precursor to be able to hear like off screen when the player was gonna need to be prepared for the next attack.
I personally like Rise better than the reboot. I think it really is the game that we wanted 2013 to be. I think one of the best additions is the sort of freeform crafting that we were able to include, where you could take this concept of scrappiness and survival and using makeshift stuff in the world and bring that into the moment-to-moment gameplay in a way that we weren't able to in the reboot. I think that's one of the most dynamic parts of the game, and the part that I think really transforms and sort of elevates the experience that we brought over from before. So that was great. I loved that we were able to build the stuff that we looked at a bunch with, lore and language and, playing up some of Lara's other strengths other than just being someone that stabs people with her axe or shoots them with a bow, that we were really able to, play up the smart side of Lara and let her be more puzzly and build up, her intelligence as a mechanic and really sort of make sure that we fleshed her out as a character and also built better, I think, opportunities from a gameplay perspective to tie all of our loops together into rewarding things that fed back into each other in a way that we didn't get to do as well in the 2013 reboot.
When we go to Rise, we had that assumption that we want to take at least 30% we already had and keep that the same and build on that. We want to have 30% brand new stuff, say what do we do, and then 30% improve. So it's the kind of idea of, the rule of thirds, of take something you know and build on it, take something you know and improve it, and to add some brand new stuff. And on the Rise world, we loved in Tomb Raider 2013 these kind of loop backs where you'd go through an area, you'd climb to a mountaintop, you'd go to another area, and then it actually would loop you back through it a second time so you could see that same area in a slightly evolved state. We wanted to expand on that and add what we called hubs. So then we had these much larger areas, these much different traversal areas that had a ton of internal loops to themselves, things like hunting or foraging or finding some of the different resources you need. So how do we actually make those gear gated so you can come back to an area like, I can't get through this, but then when you get a certain weapon or some explosives or certain types of arrows, if I go back to that hub, maybe I can get through that doorway now, or maybe I can open this broken down cave or whatever it is. So for us, creating these spaces that were much larger that players could then take as much time as they wanted, went from the kind of core narrative experience of Tomb Raider 2013 to now having a much larger space that had, I don't want to say open world, but had these open spaces where players had now this chance of, I'm in this, what we used to call the Soviet hub, because it had a certain, area and a base. You might remember it very snowy, lots of hillsides. It had an old mine in one area and an old radio tower in the other. But you had an entire area you could explore at your own pace. There's a golden path through it. That's the narrative path. But we saw most players would kind of wander off like, oh, look, there's some rabbits. I'm going to chase that rabbits down. Oh, look, there's some things I could get to make cool weapons down the path. So players had excuses now to go off path and do just light role-playing. Like, it's not a full role-playing experience, but it's a light enough experience of, I want to take these 3 different improvement paths for Lara of how I can make her better. You don't have to do any of them. You can actually get through the game without doing most of them, in fact. But people who wanted to do it could go from a 15 kind of core hour story experience if they just blazed right through it to now 40 hours of playing the game because they wanted to stay in this world.
Eidos Montreal is a fantastic group to work with. We would bring in representatives from Montreal to sit with us in the studio and do planning and design for the levels, and then they would go out back to their teams with all of this knowledge that they had gathered for working in office with us, and then they would just distribute out to their teams, and they would run their teams pretty independently for creating whole levels for us. It was really just like having another level team or two, in just a very far distant building, right? We knew pretty early in development on Rise of the Tomb Raider, I would say. We knew that Eidos Montreal was going to take the lead on that because we did have the opportunity with Marvel's Avengers coming up. So the plan was, we were the lead team on Rise of the Tomb Raider. We were going to flip that. So Eidos Montreal was going to be the lead team, and there was going to be a small core team at Crystal Dynamics still working on Shadow of the Tomb Raider. And I was the lead producer on, that Shadow of the Tomb Raider effort. And then I actually, basically didn't have an executive producer for that. So it was me and the directors on the Crystal Dynamics side working very, and it's a very close team to create our portion of that game and deliver it to Eidos Montreal.
Within the Square Enix group, Crystal Dynamics had established themselves as frontrunners when it came to making narrative-led AAA games. So when the opportunity came to use those skills on the Marvel franchise, they jumped at the chance. From the off, this project was going to be a challenge, requiring them to sharpen their core competencies and also get to grips with a few areas of design they were new to. But when the COVID-19 pandemic struck 5 months before the game's release, it didn't exactly make this challenge any easier.
If you look at the origin of the relationship between Marvel and Square Enix at just a holistic level, David Onfossey, who's the head of Montreal, actually first came with the idea of like, maybe we should work with Marvel, because at that point, you got to think this is early in what we now think of as the MCU, these 10 years of Marvel Cinematic Universe. Before that happened, like we're in those first few years of that. So David had said, hey, what if we did some kind of deal with Marvel? And then Daryl Gallagher, who was head of studios, started mapping out a plan of what could we do, how big is big, how many IP, how would we make the different studios own different franchises. And so that was a much bigger conversation that then took about 1.5 years to calm down into, well, let's talk about 2 franchises. Let's talk about a couple of games that made sense, and that became Guardians of the Galaxy and Avengers. And for us, it was, okay, this was Crystal, this was IDOS, and this was Square talking with Marvel and negotiating like what could we do, what made sense, how do we want to do this. But we never wanted to make the games of the movies or the games of the comics. We wanted to make our original take on these iconic characters that was an amalgam of all these different pieces. But we also was imperative of what differentiates us. What can we do that's going to be so clearly different that it's not the game of the movie or the show or the comic? And that became Kamala Khan. That became this new face, this character. We know something about strong female heroines leading the story. We're like, that could be fun for us. How do we put that in there?
Avengers was an interesting one. When we took it on, and the original pitch that I think we discussed with Marvel, make a very Tomb Raider-like game, but within the Marvel universe. Something very linear, very single character focused, so you would play through as one character and then switch to a different character at a different spot in the game. The earliest prototype we made, you would sort of play through a level as starting off as Iron Man, and then you would switch to Captain America, and then you would switch back at one point. And so we had this sort of ping-ponging and tag teaming of characters that would sort of keep in constant communication through radio chatter. And it was, you know, it was much more a traditional Crystal Dynamics, third-person, single-player action-adventure game. As we started to develop it, it felt like, oh, we were playing kind of like, oh, it's the Iron Man game and the Captain America game and the Black Widow game, but it didn't feel teamy enough. And so in the same way that with Tomb Raider, we, you know, went through a lot of ideation and trying a lot of things before we could sort of focus on like, what is the core of the Avengers franchise? And then for us, one of those key pillars became team. And then every time we would talk about like, well, we're gonna do a single player game, it just didn't resonate well. And so at some point we were like, do we really want to go outside of our comfort zone this far and build a multiplayer game, which we hadn't done since Snowblind. That was a big turning point for the game where it started to take on the shape that it became ultimately, but also one that was a lot of people were very hesitant about because of what it meant for the game and the scope of the game.
A lot of expectation on any new Tomb Raider game, but with something like Marvel, that's a whole new universe of expectation on it. What were some of the biggest challenges you had during the process of that development?
I think it's funny, the same word that I'd throw back at you is expectations, right? At that point, movies were evolving, the characters, the size, the scope, the bombast of what's happening inside of that world. Even in the comics themselves, we are trying to tell, as Crystal, the story that very much looks through this lens of this girl from Jersey who's just learning who she is, that her world's been turned upside down, that all the Avengers criminals and what's going on. So for us, managing that and telling what turned into be a great hero origin story with a lot of characters she unifies, but setting player expectations. Like if you think back to the E3 when we announced, it was literally a month after Endgame. And so now MCU is just kind of wrapping up and this, oh my God, these are the characters I love. And when people look at it, we're like, these aren't the same actors, these aren't the same characters. Like, yeah, we've always extended that, we've always intended that, we've always talked about it, but we hadn't done a great job of managing some of those expectations. And so to be honest, people showed up like, this doesn't feel like what I just saw, like that's intended, it's okay. And there's things that we could have done differently, and looking back, things that we could have managed that expectation much better. We loved the choice we made because it let us do an original take on these characters and let us explore spaces nobody else had. And that was really one of the biggest challenges for us, was just getting that messaging right and then getting players to see like, no, really, trust us, this is going to be fun, but you have to be willing to come with us on a different journey.
We kept building upon one engine, and that engine was a engine that was a single-player engine for the last 15 years. Previously, we had built Snowblind on the Go engine, which was the multiplayer engine. And so converting our Tomb Raider engine to support multiplayer was a huge undertaking. And so it took a lot of hard work by a lot of very talented people to be able to make the engine do that. But as soon as we got 2 players playing together, 3 players playing together, and really were able to see what it was like to play the game as part of a team, it's when we really were like, okay, that was worth it. We made the right decision.
So if you think back over the last now 3 years, like March 13th, 2020, everybody out, but having to work from home from a studio that's used to being in a facility next to each other, being able to QA and user test, we weren't allowed to take dev kits or test kits home. Like it was a legal thing that you weren't supposed to take stuff off site, it needed to be secured. So we had to work through so many new challenges. Oh my gosh, we have to make the biggest thing we've ever made as a game, the hardest thing we've ever made as a game, because we've never made it before, with, at the end of the day, 10, now 11 different heroes, and had to make them feel different, had to make them look different, had to build the content, had to build the online component for co-op. All of these pieces, now through the production pathway, you get past the pandemic and actually get to launch. We had tested it, we were very confident, we launched when we thought it was the right time to launch, we felt good about it. We're like, oh my God, okay, what the hell, we didn't know this, we didn't know this. And so we had a lot of dirt to clean off of us, to be honest. It was a humbling experience as Crystal, to go out there from what we're used to doing for Tomb Raider and for Rise, and now getting kind of, this cold water splash, and I was like, oh my gosh, we gotta pick up the pace and fix things. So we kept the team dedicated and focused for adding the post-launch heroes, for adding Wakanda, for adding all this content and fixing all these things as we went that we didn't know were there until we had literally millions of people playing it. Because testing in a pandemic, getting the feedback, like you only had so much you could do. Like even today, we're still fighting every day. What new things can we add to kind of raise the profile and elevation and feed the characters' needs? Because the players every day are asking us for more stuff. That's a good thing, right? Folks look at that and like, oh, what's gonna happen with this game? Like every day we get asks for more content. That's what you want from a fan base, is to say, yep, okay, you guys have now gotten this done, I want more. But what else could I want?
We interviewed the folks at Crystal Dynamics around the time of their 30-year anniversary, but this moment in time is also a moment of huge transition for the studio. The office we filmed in is a new one, only recently opened after the studio moved during the COVID-19 pandemic. Many of the folks we interviewed had never actually stepped through its front doors yet, the studio having embraced hybrid work and remote hiring. They've also opened 2 satellite studios up too, Crystal Northwest just outside of Seattle and Crystal Southwest in Austin, Texas. Crystal have also announced a partnership with SoCal studio The Initiative to work on the upcoming Perfect Dark reboot. That studio was founded by ex-Crystal head of studio Daryl Gallagher. And if that wasn't enough, a new Tomb Raider is also in the works, being built in Unreal 5. So gone are the days of Lara being measured in Gexels. But larger still is the news that Crystal Dynamics and their sister studio Eidos Montreal are the latest to be acquired by Embracer Group, the ever-growing holding company seemingly interested in bringing back some of those old IPs. Don't worry, we'll get around to that in a second, but before we look forward, I wanted to take one more glance back. The history of Crystal is long and impossible to sum up in any one moment or career, but there are a few themes that have stuck out to us from interviewing dozens of its former and current employees. Crystal is clearly a studio which demands a lot from its talent, where competence and work ethic are rewarded. There's a high level of competency here that allows this much smaller team to create AAA games on a fraction of the resources that their competitors enjoy. I've no doubt that with this comes a lot of work. But it also strikes me as a place that understands the stresses games development can have on people, and we've heard countless stories of studio management bending or changing rules to accommodate the lives of its developers, be it in getting work visas for foreign employees, supporting personal initiatives like adding accessibility to their games, or accommodating those who are moving out of state, just to name a few. And while Amy Hennig may have lost that opportunity to lead Tomb Raider, there's no denying that Lara Croft has changed the demographic of this studio since. You've probably noticed that yourself over the past 2 hours of interviews. Perhaps this is why we've met so many of these boomerangs, people who left Crystal Dynamics but then came back. Making people feel valued is clearly part of the studio's legacy, so whatever the future holds for Crystal and its intellectual properties, that culture is something they want to retain.
I think with Tomb Raider franchise and Lara, it draws women in, you know, it's like she's a strong female character. It's like you want to be a part of that experience and say, you know what, I helped this character evolve, and you know, I was a part of something big, and I think that is a huge factor that draws people in.
I mean, it's hard for me to say because I've only worked really for 2 big organizations, but my experience here has been overwhelmingly positive. I was very worried when I chose to have a kid that I would lose my progress in my career, right? Because if I lose it, it's going to be really hard to get back, and I don't want that, right? And I actually also expressed that to Crystal. It's like I want my career to continue progressing. Like I want to transition into a lead role. I want to be more involved, right? But I also want to have a kid. You know, like how do I do that? And I have felt very, very supported.
You know, again, you have to figure out where your own boundaries are with the family. I think anybody that joins the industry has to have that kind of eyes wide open idea. You're going to pour yourself into something. I think there's a place, you know, for like you said, you know, both ends of the spectrum. Somebody that wants to, I want to be at the studio all day. I just want to do that because that's me. I want to do it. To the other people, I was like, hey, I got other things to do outside of this. That's absolutely welcomed. And I would say we've offered something here that allows for both.
I think right now, if I can remember, our median age is like 40, like 37, 40, which is pretty amazing in the video game industry. We all know it's a very male-dominated industry, but as over the years, it's just like evolved, and I see more and more women, more and more people of color, and here we still have a lot of work to do, but it's amazing to see it. You know, it's like I'm not the only woman in the studio anymore, so it's great.
I love Crystal. It has been my home for the last 20 years. I can't really imagine working anywhere else. I mean, everyone here is basically like family. I work with a lot of the same people that I've been working with since Whiplash, which is crazy to think about. But yeah, I plan to stick around and see where things take us in the future. And excited to be working on Perfect Dark and see where that goes.
You know, they've clearly evolved and been able to change and adapt as a studio over time to whatever the market needs were, but retain an identity that I think has been consistent. You know, they've never been the superstar, you know, high-profile studio. They've been kind of a little under the radar, but, you know, doing great work. And if you look at the number of people that have been through Crystal and gone on and done other things in the industry, you know, there's this common, it's like 7 steps from Kevin Bacon or something, right? Like, you know, it's like 7 steps from Crystal Dynamics in the industry.
It's a reunion when you go to places like E3 or any industry events, you know, GDCs and stuff like that, and it's hard to walk down a hall without bumping into somebody. And like you said, over 20 years, you're seeing people establish their own studios, right? Definitely becoming masters of their trades and becoming experts. That's awesome.
You know, the reason that Crystal survived and thrived is because great people produced great games with an eye towards passion and quality. That it wasn't seen as a business exercise, it was seen as a labor of love.
I love this question because we get it a lot, actually, from people who interview for jobs here. They ask, like, oh, what's the future of Crystal and where are you going? And I'd say, look at our last 10 years. That gives you a pretty good roadmap of what our next 10 years looks like. How do we grow? How do we expand? How do we open locations in smart places? How do we actually improve quality of life for all the people who work here? And so when you look at it from what our next 10 years is, I'd say it's 5 words. You ain't seen nothing yet.
And then my last question, what is, of all the old Crystal games, what is the one people ask for you to go back to more than any?
It's Legacy of Kain, hands down. It's like, it's a setup, you know it's a setup. It certainly is. Like, even when we announced the Embracer deal and we talked about the IP that come with us, they're like, oh, Legacy of Kain. I'm like, yeah, okay, like, calm down. Everybody just stay calm, we're focused over here. But it is certainly, there's not a single piece of content we put out for Avengers that there wasn't a tweet somewhere in the same thread like, when are you going to bring back LOK? I'm like, okay, just everybody calm down. Like, it's so exciting, though, to have such a beloved franchise and to have people who look at that and say, look, Tomb Raider's great, we can't wait for the next Tomb Raider. Look, Avengers is cool, keep adding new content to it. Perfect Dark, okay, this is interesting, let's see where this goes. That's Microsoft's franchise, not ours, but it's still ours now as we're part of that knit woven fabric to make it great. But LOK top down is the one that people ask for the most.
All right. We ain't seen nothing yet.
Ain't seen nothing yet.